Humanity has sent many different objects into space over the years, and without a doubt, all of them have been incredibly helpful in our cosmic journey. But arguably, the single most beneficial structure ever launched into space is the International Space Station. So why aren't we building a second International Space Station instead of just pushing forward with the old one? Today we're going to dive deep into the construction phase of the International Space Station, explore the exact reasons why a second one isn't being built, and uncover some truly fascinating facts about life up there. Before we jump into the video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like my videos, and drop your thoughts in the comments for new video ideas. Now if you're ready, let's get into the video. First of all, the concept of building a station in space stems from humanity's deep curiosity about one day living beyond Earth. For many years, this idea remained nothing more than a fantasy and a product of science fiction. However, by the mid-20th century, modern technology finally allowed us to push our boundaries and turn this dream into reality. Especially during the Cold War era, it wasn't just about science. It was a war of power, prestige, and ideological supremacy. The Soviet Union managed to send the first human into space and later successfully established the very first space station. The United States didn't want to fall behind Russia in the space race, so the Soviets, achieving things so rapidly, pushed America toward much grander goals. The earliest space stations produced were quite short-lived and limited. Rather than enabling humanity to live in space permanently, these stations were actually a way to answer whether we could build the kind of structures that would allow it in the future. The answer to whether we could live continuously in space was born unexpectedly through cooperation after years of intense rivalry. With the end of the Cold War, two superpowers that had been fierce rivals for decades sat down at the exact same table. This wasn't just a political decision, it was an economic necessity for both nations. Even in the era we live in now, space exploration is incredibly costly for any nation, and decades ago, due to the lack of advanced technology, those costs were astronomically higher. Consequently, governments were beginning to crush under the weight of these expenses. This is exactly why these two superpowers joined forces and decided to combine their strengths. Furthermore, building a permanent station in space is not a project that a single country can handle alone. At this exact junction, the International Space Station, where every nation now wants to hang its flag, was born. The actual construction of the station was far more complicated than people think. The station wasn't launched into space on a single rocket, it wasn't built by a single country, and it wasn't the product of a single blueprint. On the contrary, it was the culmination of decades of planning, cancelled ideas, engineering redesigns, and political negotiations. The very first module was launched into space when the calendar marked 1998. Later on, other modules were sent up and assembled in space, like pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle. Astronauts built this massive structure by performing grueling spacewalks lasting hours in the middle of a vacuum, hundreds of kilometers above Earth. This process was the clearest, most tangible proof that humanity could build a structure entirely outside of Earth. As the station edged closer to completion month by month, what emerged wasn't just a structure or a terminal, it was a true living habitat. In the year 2000, the first permanent crew reached the station, and on that historic day, a brand new era in human history began. From that moment on, space was no longer just a place to visit, it became a region where humanity actively lived, even if in small numbers. This continuity was absolutely vital for scientists and the broader scientific community, because having astronauts permanently stationed there allowed researchers to conduct experiments that are completely impossible to perform on Earth. For instance, for humanity to permanently live in space, we first needed to know exactly what happens to the human body in that environment. Astronauts heading to the International Space Station were meticulously observed during their time in microgravity, and every shift in their bodies was documented. Their bone density decreased, their muscles began to atrophy, and their immune systems reacted in entirely different ways. This data provided critical insights for the long-duration space voyages of the future, but the station's importance certainly wasn't limited to human biology alone. As I mentioned, the microgravity environment allowed for experiments that are a physical impossibility on Earth. Fluids behave entirely differently than they do on Earth. Flames burn in perfect spheres, and cells grow in completely unique structures. Because of this, drug development processes accelerated, brand new pathways in cancer research opened up, and significant breakthroughs were made in materials science. The ISS also turned into a magnificent platform for observing Earth. Thanks to the ISS, scientists could continuously track climate change, melting glaciers, wildfires, and atmospheric changes in extreme detail. While the ISS was executing such wildly successful work, there was one question lingering in people's minds: the cost of the ISS. This station was unbelievably expensive. In fact, calculations showed that the total cost of the ISS surpassed $150 billion. This price tag made it one of the most expensive structures in human history. Moreover, this financial burden wasn't just limited to the building phase. The ISS requires incredibly expensive maintenance in every single period. The cost of maintenance is separate, the cost of parts is separate, and the cost of operational procedures is separate. In fact, these expenditures exceed billions of dollars in total every single year. Because of this, a new question has crossed people's minds recently. With today's advanced technology and much cheaper, more durable materials, why aren't we just building a brand new station? In reality, the answer to this question doesn't point to a single reason. The first reason is that the ISS is still actively serving as a highly multifunctional asset. Even though it's a structure from years ago, it still completely fulfills its required duties. So logically speaking, using the existing station makes far more sense than building a brand new one from scratch. But this answer is merely the tip of the iceberg. When you dive deeper into the matter, the issue is much more profound than it seems. Today, space politics have shifted completely compared to decades ago. We have moved from an environment of direct competition between nations, like during the Cold War, to an era where private corporations play an active role. In other words, space is no longer just the playground of governments, it has become a backyard for corporations as well. This massive shift is one of the biggest reasons a new ISS isn't being built. Instead of allocating gigantic budgets to establish a new station, governments prefer to leave this task to the private sector. To give an example, SpaceX has accomplished things in recent years that many nations couldn't dream of, bringing countless innovations to space technology and space travel. For instance, booster engines that detached from the main rocket used to fall straight into the ocean and get destroyed. But thanks to SpaceX technology, booster rockets can now successfully land back on the surface and be reused over and over again for other missions. This breakthrough by a private company completely saved many nations from the massive financial burden of producing new rockets. Innovations like this generally come through private companies, and this works perfectly to the advantage of governments. Because of this, instead of directly building a new station, NASA is investing in commercial space stations developed by private corporations. These signs clearly show us that one era in space travel is closing and a brand new one is beginning. Another major reason is the change in our technological approach. The ISS is a colossal and intricate structure, but today it's possible to develop smaller, modular, and much cheaper stations. This causes the idea of multiple smaller stations to look far more appealing than the concept of one giant station. So, in all likelihood, we will see a multitude of small-scale space stations belonging to different companies and countries in the next century, rather than one massive ISS. And who knows, maybe corporations and countries will even organize space tours to these stations for massive sums of money, allowing ordinary people to spend time in space. Of course, when I say ordinary people, I don't mean working-class citizens like us. It will generally be individuals belonging to the bourgeois class. Anyway, alongside all these factors, there are also political dynamics at play. The ISS was born as a joint project between the US and Russia, but looking at things today, the relationship between these two nations is incredibly strained. This makes a new joint station project highly unlikely. Furthermore, other countries like India and China have entirely different plans. For example, China has already established its own space station, and this station is a completely independent project. This indicates that a brand new era of competition in space has officially begun. When you look at these dynamics, it isn't very difficult to predict the scenarios we might face in the future. Most likely, every country will have its own stations, and the corporations within those countries will both own their private stations and be able to dock with the stations of the nations they are tied to. At this point, the question of whether these stations will collide might pop into your head. However, this is an incredibly low probability, practically bordering on impossible. To put it simply, it's like two fishing boats colliding with each other in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. In fact, the mathematical probability is even lower than that. Setting future stations aside, the ISS holds critical importance for us today, because one way or another, a certain portion of humanity will permanently live in space one day, and the ISS gives us a magnificent opportunity to simulate those environments. Even though life on the ISS looks calm and controlled from the outside, it is a living experiment that pushes the absolute boundaries of the human body and mind. Every single day spent in zero gravity is full of small but critical changes that remind the body it belongs to planet Earth. In the first few days, astronauts generally lose their sense of direction and experience extreme difficulty navigating, because in space, concepts like up and down completely lose their meaning. Furthermore, even controlling a simple movement becomes exceptionally difficult. More importantly, while the body tries to adapt to this environment, it actually begins to slowly deteriorate. Because the bones no longer carry weight, they lose their density, and the muscles melt away from lack of use. The heart adjusts to working less and less every day. Because of this, astronauts on the ISS are forced to exercise for hours every single day. Otherwise, they could lose their literal ability to walk when they return to Earth. But these physical changes are only a fraction of the hardship. The part that is spoken about far less, but is just as vital as the physical changes, is the psychological toll. You are living between the same metal walls in a confined space with the exact same people for months, trying to coexist. Over time, this creates psychological pressure on anyone. Even the concept of sunrise and sunset changes completely, because astronauts up there witness a sunrise 16 times in a standard 24-hour cycle. This completely shatters the human biological clock. This is why NASA and other agencies place just as much emphasis on the psychological resilience of astronauts as they do on their physical capabilities, because the smallest mistake made in space can lead to completely irreversible consequences. This is exactly why the ISS is not just a science laboratory, it is simultaneously a testing ground for humanity's dress rehearsal for survival in space. Even though the experiments conducted here often look ordinary, they actually serve the grandest goals of our future. For example, protein crystals grown in microgravity reach a level of purity that cannot be manufactured on Earth, contributing significantly to the development of new medicines. Or experiments aimed at understanding how plants grow in space could pave the way for us to farm on Mars in the future. In fact, let me give you a piece of information. At a certain point, astronauts successfully managed to grow and consume their own lettuce. While this might look like a tiny detail to you right now, it is actually one of the first major steps toward establishing a self-sustaining life in space. Of course, the experiments done on the ISS aren't limited to just these. Some experiments are directly aimed at understanding the literal boundaries of the universe. Work such as measuring cosmic rays, searching for clues regarding dark matter, and examining the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere helps us comprehend what lies beyond our planet. Yet, interestingly, the most profound aspect of the ISS is how it fundamentally changes our perspective on Earth. Almost every single astronaut who has been up there states that looking at Earth from space alters a person's entire mindset. Borders become completely invisible, countries vanish, and all that remains is a single, solitary planet. This profound experience is known as the overview effect, and it completely reshapes how most astronauts view life after they return to Earth. Unfortunately, despite all these scientific and human achievements, the reality that the ISS could not exist forever was known right from the very beginning. Because space is an incredibly harsh and unforgiving environment. The station is constantly subjected to micrometeorite impacts, experiences extreme temperature swings, and develops metal fatigue over time. The detection of small cracks in certain sections of the station clearly shows us that this degradation process has already begun. Air leaks have occurred from time to time, particularly in the Russian modules, becoming one of the most tangible indicators that the station is aging. This is why the end of the ISS is being openly discussed today. It might surprise you, but according to current plans, the station will be decommissioned around the year 2030 by being intentionally guided back into Earth's atmosphere to be destroyed. I know this creates a strange sense of sorrow and emptiness inside a person, but unfortunately, it is the safest method available. The massive structure will be steered to crash into a remote, uninhabited region of the Pacific Ocean. In other words, humanity's greatest engineering feat will be destroyed under humanity's own control. Unfortunately, that is the bittersweet reality. Of course, plans and scenarios can always change. Perhaps the ISS will somehow manage to preserve its existence for a much longer period than predicted. We shouldn't lose all hope. I truly hope you enjoyed my video and liked what I shared. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel to support me, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Take great care of yourselves until we meet in our next video. Goodbye.